Welcome to the top 10 at 10. Today is May the 2nd, 2014. I'm your host, Dan Wright, writer at FireDogLake.com, and these are the top 10 news stories. Story number 10. This is from The Nation. Look who the folks who took down Acorn are targeting now. Right-wing operatives with links to big retailers going after worker centers like the Restaurant Opportunity Center. This is from Li Fang. In a presentation at the Drake Hotel in Chicago last October, Joseph Kafar addressed a conference of executives from companies like Nike, Macy's, and Crate & Barrel, among other leading brands. Kafar, that's probably right, Kafar, a key player in the rising cottage industry of lobbyists and consultants hired by the retail sector, warned his audience that a new movement was taking hold, one that could leverage the, quote, exponential growth of grassroots networks, unquote, to force change in corporations beyond the reach of traditional labor unions. These activists, Kefauer explained in his PowerPoint presentation, could create a pressure in the media through a supply chain and even in the policy and political arena, making them a threat to businesses' bottom line unlike any other. In addition, he noted ominously, these new groups were spreading beyond the big cities and blue states and have established a, quote, left-of-center beachhead in traditionally conservative areas. The conference attendees were then asked to consider the pushback. How aggressive can we be? One slide read, how do we challenge the social justice narrative? So, Kefauer is a former executive for public affairs at Walmart and a former political action committee staffer for Darden Restaurants, the parent company of chain eateries like Olive Garden and Red Lobster. As a full-time consultant at firms that serve the restaurant and retail industry, he is part of a phalanx of lobbyists and political operatives with a small but focused goal to destroy what has become known as, quote, worker center movement. Worker center movement. Okay, so Kefauer's alarm at the rise of worker centers, which he has repeated the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other business trade groups, isn't simply bluster. Just as conservatives aim their fire to devastating effect at organized labor and low-wage advocacy groups like Acorn in the past decade, right-wing lobbyists and the businesses that pay them are going after worker centers today because they recognize their potency. With unions in decline, a fact celebrated in one recent ad targeting worker centers, the alt-labor movement has helped jumpstart a nationwide effort to reshape working conditions for millions of Americans in low-wage jobs. The question is, can workers' centers escape the fate of other similarly situated groups targeted by corporate smear campaigns? So apparently these worker centers are causing some concern among the union busters that are hired by the sort of larger companies to go and take them on politically, which they went, the Olive Garden and Walmart and all these people like to, launder their their efforts through these front groups. But so this is an interesting read. I definitely think you should check it out over at The Nation. Story number 9. I'll get that. Okay, everyone is reading Piketty wrong, including Piketty. It's from Jesse Meyerson. As everybody knows, R is greater than G. That is, under capitalism's natural pressures, wealth tends to concentrate. We have a convincingly large data set to show it, thanks to Thomas Piketty, whose 700-page economics tome, Capital in the 21st Century, is beating out Colton Burbo on Amazon. Capital assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, land, patents, yield returns, profits, dividends, interest, rents, royalties, and the rate R at which these flows to the people who own them tends to outpace the growth of the full economy, G. Only when this process is interrupted by wars, which destroy the capital stock, inflation, which devalues assets, or a baby boom, is G ever able to keep pace with R, whereupon a rising tide is able to do its thing. Unless something powerful is pumping up G, equality and democracy are impossible. The liberal response to this conundrum, including Piketty's, is to try to grow G through more egalitarian taxation and stimulus and whatnot, but this concedes way too much when we can actually solve the conundrum. The bulk of society doesn't need to be devoted to accommodating the tiny number of people who capture R and ride capitalism's natural flow merrily, merrily, merrily. It is not necessary for everybody to keep bending over backward to grow the economy just in order to help one another survive. There is a way out of the conflict, a way of generating equality as naturally as capitalism generates inequality. Make sure the people who capture R is everybody. If the stream of wealth flows to everyone rather than Donald Trump and Mitt Romney, then the pressure's off G to keep pace with R. If R is shared democratically, we don't have to keep extracting natural resources and conquering territories and desperately trying to grow G just so everyone is taken care of. We can just let R exceed G and focus on more meaningful ways in sales, which GDP, i.e. growth, reflects, things like availing ourselves of our inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness. Instead of insisting on this obvious point, Piketty is stuck trying to advocate an unworkable technocratic fix, a global progressive tax on wealth. This, by the way, is why when people associate him with Marxism, they're full of it. Other progressive economists are squabbling over the details of what counts as capital. Who cares about the different types of capital functioning differently? The answer is the same for all of them. Send the R in its particular form to everybody. Stocks and bonds can be held by sovereign wealth funds. Rent and real estate can flow to everyone by taxing land value. By liberalizing intellectual property regimes and moving to creative commons structure, we can make sure our society's ideas aren't just a source of cash for pharmaceutical companies, media conglomerates, and litigious vultures. Look, the economy is so screwed up at the moment that we could use some G boosting in addition to R democratizing, but make no mistake, only one of these is capable of shutting down the chief engine generating inequality. Why rage against the machine, has been asked, when you can just unplug it? I know I read that whole thing, but it's definitely worth a read. Jesse Meyerson over at Salon. Story number 8. Here's the image from Obama's trip to the Philippines that he doesn't want you to see. That's him being burned in effigy. That's the reception he got when he visited Manila's presidential palace on Monday. Some 800 activists gathered to protest his signing of a new agreement that grants U.S. forces comprehensive access to Filipino military bases. Obama's welcome party included a massive effigy of him riding a chariot pulled by Philippine President Benigno Aquino, who was depicted as a dog. Both were promptly set ablaze. So this is part of the pivot to Asia, where Obama administration has been putting forces in Philippines, Australia. We're still in South Korea, obviously, Japan, Taiwan. I mean, it's your humble republic has quite a military footprint in Asia, and now with TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this is sort of a strategy to box out China, which we've empowered through sending most of our manufacturing base there. So it's a pretty ridiculous game being played. Story number 7. This is interesting. This was kind of interesting. The New York Times is not going to turn into BuzzFeed. Bill Keller and Marcus Brookley, however you say his name, have edited all 3 great American newspapers: the New York Times for Keller, both the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post for Brookley. But their opportunity and curse was to have done so during the most disruptive decade for journalism since, well, forever. I don't know about that. I think the Gutenberg press was probably pretty disruptive. Tellingly, they're both in the new media startup business these days, with Keller leaving to launch a nonprofit website dedicated to reporting on criminal justice, and Brookley traveling the world, investing in emerging market media. We sat down for salads and Diet Cokes with them in New York recently to debrief on the end of the golden era, as Keller put it, the rise of the wonks, the silliness of CNN, and how great journalism will survive the transformation of the newspapers that have produced so much of it. This is sort of an interesting interview if you're trying to get inside the head of the media elite douchebags, which they both are. I mean, they're both douchebags. But you will get their views on media. It's worth it. You're probably not going to agree with a lot of it, but it's at least worth reading, understand why they think the way they do, and just how far white male privilege goes. Story number 6 from Paul Krugman, Why Economics Failed. On Wednesday, I wrapped up the class I've been teaching all semester, The Great Recession. And while teaching the course was fun, I found myself turning at the end to an agonizing question. Why, at the moment it was most needed and could have done the most good, did economics fail? I don't mean that economics was useless to policymakers. On the contrary, the discipline has a lot to offer. While it's true that few economists saw the crisis coming, mainly, I'd argue, because few realized how fragile our deregulated financial system had become and how vulnerable debt-burdened families were to a plunge in housing prices, the clean little secret of recent years is that since the fall of Lehman Brothers, basic textbook macroeconomics has performed very well. But policymakers and politicians have ignored both the textbooks and the lessons of history, and the result has been a vast economic and human catastrophe with trillions of dollars of productive potential squandered and millions of families placed in dire straits for no good reason. In what sense did economics work well? I mean, that's a valid question. I mean, if you believe in the Keynesian school that he does, well, why didn't it work? Well, why wasn't it even tried, right? That's the difficult part of it. Whatever the reasons, basic economics got tossed aside and the results have been tragic. Most of the waste and suffering that have afflicted Western economies these past 5 years was unnecessary. We have all along had the knowledge and tools to restore full employment, but policymakers just keep finding reasons not to do the right thing. It's, I guess, an open question whether Keynesianism would have worked. I mean, but I think to his point and to his credit and to an agreement, I guess, point of agreement between us, it wasn't tried. I will agree with that. They didn't try it, and they tried austerity, which made things generally worse. So, story number 5. This is from the Atlantic. This is kind of a weird piece, but it's worth a read. A eulogy for Twitter. The beloved social publishing platform enters its twilight. We've been trying to figure out the moment Twitter turned, retracing tweets to see whether there was something specific that soured the platform. Something is wrong on Twitter, and people are noticing, or at least the kind of people who we hang around with on Twitter are noticing, and it's maybe not a very important demographic, this very weird and specific kind of user. Audience obsessed, curious, newsy. Twitter's earnings last quarter, after all, were an improvement on the period before, and it added 14 million new users for a total of 255 million. The thing is, its users are less active than they once were. Twitter says these changes reflect a more streamlined experience. But we have a different theory. Twitter is entering its twilight. I'll read, I guess, a little bit more of this. The publishing platform that carried us into the mobile internet age is receding. Its influence on publishing will remain, but the platform's place in internet culture is changing in a way that feels irreversible and echoes the tradition of AIM and pre-2005 blogging. A lot of this argument comes down to what we feel. Communities can't be fully measured by how many people are in them, so as we suss out cultural changes, relying on first-hand experience is a first step. Twitter used to be a sort of surrogate newsroom, bar room where you could organize around ideas with people whose opinions you wanted to assess. Maybe you wouldn't agree with everybody, but that was part of the fun. But at some point, Twitter narratives started to look the same. The crowd became predictable, and not in a good way. Too much of Twitter was cruel and petty and fake. Everyone we know from experience about social publishing platforms, about any publishing platforms, is that they change, and it can be hard to track the interplay between design changes and behavioral ones. In other words, did Twitter change Twitter, or did we? I don't know if I buy any of this, to be honest, but take a look. But in terms of media critiques, this has got to be the most fun. Scoops when journalists masturbate. Felix Salmon. The quote is beginning to get some press attention, so I ought to correct the record. I said masturbatory, not masturbating. Glad that's cleared up. In fact, the full quote was captured by FT's John Byrne Murdoch. Breaking news is the most masturbatory thing journalists do. The reader couldn't give a flying fuck who broke it, unquote. A bit of context here, I was giving a talk about wonk journalism at the International Journalism Festival in Perugia, and in the Q&A I was asked about whether there was a problem with the fact that explanatory journalism doesn't break news. In particular, I was asked about this quote by James Ball. Basically, explanatory journalism doesn't break news, so why would people go and see it? So Simon disagrees. He says the scoop, basically the idea of a scoop, getting it first, rather than getting something that no one's heard about before is, no one, or new information rather than information everyone's going to have in a bit, is only important to journalists. The public doesn't care. Journalists, of course, spend a huge amount of time looking at their rivals' content in their solipsistic way. They generally assume that if they've seen a certain story elsewhere, then their readers will have seen that story too. Every journalist in America can tell you about a project they were working on in which was spiked when their editor saw something vaguely similar elsewhere, even when the overlap between the two publications' readerships was roughly zero. So but reporting news and cultivating sources is a different thing from breaking news, from being the person who reports the news 5 minutes or 5 seconds faster than the other guy. And if you're not focused on scooping the competition on something incremental, then you're going to have more bandwidth available for being able to talk to your sources about the big picture, where the real value is. So let's try to move away from scoop culture and away from journalism for journalists. Instead, let's serve our readers, the real readers, the ones who aren't on Twitter. Story number 3. This is just a fun story. Scientists discovered the Egyptian secret to moving huge pyramid stones. I thought it was interesting because it's been a question that's been going around for a while. The question of just how an ancient civilization, without the help of modern technology, moved 2.5-ton stones that made up their famed pyramids has long plagued Egyptologists and mechanical engineers alike. But now a team from the University of Amsterdam believes they figured it out, even though the solution was staring them in the face all along. It all comes down to friction. See, the ancient Egyptians would transport their rocky cargo across the desert sands from quarry to monument site with large sleds, pretty basic sleds, basically just large slabs with upturned edges. Now, when you try to pull a large slab with an upturned edge carrying 2.5-ton load, it tends to dig into the sand ahead of it, building up a sand burn that must then be regularly cleared before it can become a bigger obstacle. Wet sand, however, doesn't do this. In sand with just the right amount of dampness, capillary bridges, essentially micro droplets of water that bind grains of sand to one another through capillary action, form across the grains, which doubles the material's relative stiffness. This prevents the sand from burning in front of the sled and cuts the force required to drag the sled in half. So there you go. They wet the sand. How about that? Story number 2. This is just disgraceful journalism. Biking with Bush, former president, opens up about veterans. This is Jake Tapper over at CNN, who did this really complimentary piece on George W. Bush about how much he cares about veterans, and it's just really gross. And he compared him to Eisenhower in the interview, which General Eisenhower and George W. Bush have very little in common. It was basically an attempt to rehabilitate George Bush's image, which is why it's, I guess, of interest to the Bush crowd. I don't know why CNN felt like that's their job, but so it's very complimentary and pretty awful journalism. And the number 1 story, but if you click on it, Kiev launches major assault in East Ukraine. After claiming for days they were unable to control East Ukraine, the gang in Kiev has launched a major assault in East Ukraine. The anti-terrorist operation focused on the towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, where residents were warned to stay in their homes and avoid windows. The military operation risks bringing Russia into the conflict and setting up a full-scale civil war in Ukraine. But like the first assault, things do not seem to be going smoothly, as 2 helicopters have been brought down by pro-Russian forces, with casualties being reported. Kiev is reporting that pro-Russian forces have advanced military equipment. 2 Mi 24 helicopters have been taken out with mobile air defense systems. The terrorists opened fire at Ukrainian units with some heavy guns, including grenade launchers and portable air defense systems. Russia has condemned the assault by Kiev as totally unacceptable, with Putin's spokesman saying it was the last nail in the coffin of the Geneva Peace Accord. It seems we are one step closer to an all-out civil war in Ukraine. The elections that were scheduled to be held at the end of the month appear increasingly impossible. That's the takeaway from there. The elections are really, that are scheduled for May 25th, I believe, are just not going to happen. I mean, or not going to happen smoothly, if at all. So, good times. Good times had by all. Let's see here. And that is the top 10 of 10. Okay, we're back. If you have a story you'd like me to feature on the top 10 of 10, please tweet me at DanSWright on Twitter and read all the stories at firedoggreg.com. Thanks. See you later.